All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 2, Early Globalization, the Atlantic World, 1492 to 1650. Here we'll be looking at Section 1, Portuguese Exploration and Spanish Conquest. So a point to make here about the title of this section is the difference between the ways that Portugal and Spain interact around the world. Portugal very much was more about establishing an overseas empire. So we might say for Portugal, it was more about a maritime empire and trade, which served really as the backbone for Portuguese. While the Spanish, while they did have a maritime empire of their own, it was more of a land-based empire. So we might say land empire. That is to conquer large swaths of territory, mainly in the New World, North and South America, and more so organized really as a conquest. This was a takeover, so to speak. So the way that Portugal and Spain differ from one another in their interactions around the world and in the Atlantic world are different, and it's worth noting. Now, this term, the Atlantic world, refers to the interactions between Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans. In fact, chapter 1, the last chapter, we talked a little bit about each of these parts of the world and the people that inhabited those regions. But that was before 1492. After 1492, so after 1492, all these parts of the world interact with each other. And if we look at the Atlantic world, it's based off of the Atlantic Ocean, which if you were to just draw sort of a crude map of both the Old World and the New World, we'll just say that's South America. Here we go, Alaska up here. So that's North America and South America. We have Africa here, Saudi Arabia, India, around to China, Russia, Scandinavia. We'll do Europe here, Mediterranean, the Italian boot, right? Old World and New World. If we map on to where these areas are located, we'll notice that, for the Americas, they're all along this coast, right? That's the Americas. Europe here and Africa here. And right in the middle of those two land masses is, of course, the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic world then refers to the connections between all these parts that, especially after 1492, being the year that Columbus made his voyage from Spain into the Bahamas, now all these parts of the world are interconnected with one another. And this even gets back at the title of the chapter, which is Early Globalization, meaning that there is a emerging global economy, emerging global society, culture, etc., etc. So let's first focus on the Portuguese. And if we recall from last section, the Portuguese were what we called the pioneers of the Age of Exploration, meaning that they were the first European country to really dedicate a lot of resources and effort to overseas expansion. Prince Henry the Navigator, who was influential in Portugal, just go ahead and make a note that he is from Portugal, helped to establish a navigation school, amongst other things, that eventually fed into Portuguese overseas exploration. Now, for Portugal, like we mentioned before, as compared with Spain, Portugal essentially established strategic holdings, that is, various bases located around the world. These bases served as trading posts, and most notably, the first ones were in Western Africa, where the Portuguese traded for slaves, ivory, and gold. So we might say of these commodities that Portugal obtained these things from Africa. In fact, probably one of the more famous Portuguese strategic holdings, not just in Africa, but really around the world, is Elmina Castle. Actually, I'm going to adjust this picture so it can be a little bit more visible. So this is Elmina Castle in Africa is where it is. And this was a base for which Portuguese ships would arrive. African traders would then give the Portuguese things like slaves, ivory, and gold, amongst other things. The Portuguese mainly giving the Africans weapons, amongst other European goods. But one important thing to take note of, and we mentioned this last section, was that many of the slaves were used to grow sugar. And it was by sugar, right? We're going to say sugar is the crop that brought African slavery to the New World. And in addition to establishing these trading posts and strategic holdings in Africa, the Portuguese also would later on establish them in places like India, modern day Indonesia. We might just sort of summarize that as Southeast Asia and other places around the world, establishing trade with a lot of different people. By contrast, the Spanish, while they were also interested in exploration, were much more, ended up having much more to do with conquest and accumulating an empire that consisted of both North and South America. Like we mentioned last section, Ferdinand and Isabella, these were the monarchs of Spain. They united their crowns to create the modern Spanish state. They created a unified Catholic Spain. We want to take note of that especially. You know, Spain, especially in this time period, we want to associate them very heavily with the Catholic Church. In many ways, Spain is going to be one of the leading nations championing the cause of the Catholic Church. This coincided with the Reconquista. Recall that this was the war, or really the 700-year or 800-year conflict between Catholics and Muslims in Spain. And this coincided very nicely with the year 1492, which was when the Reconquista ended, and it was Catholic Spain that emerged victorious. So after that, after having eliminated the competition, so to speak, Ferdinand and Isabella and the modern nation of Spain could then focus on their own overseas exploration and try and rival Portugal. The motives for Spain, why did they want to go out and explore overseas territories? Well, one, we want to also note the religious motivation, spread Catholicism. This is very much still in the spirit of the Crusades, but also, of course, money to gain the commercial advantage over Portugal. So there are two different motives at work here. One we could say is purely financial. The other one we might say is cultural, to spread the Catholic Church. Now, as we know, Spain eventually hired Christopher Columbus, who promised, or at least claimed, that he could arrive in Asia by sailing west to India here. Recall that the goal of Columbus was to sail west to India in order to obtain Eastern trade. That is, when we think about Eastern, at least in this context, we can think of places like India and China, right? That's what the goal was. Now, Columbus miscalculated the size of the world. Remember that Columbus said of the size of the world that it was smaller. Actually, let's go ahead. We'll say Columbus claimed it was smaller. And because he was incorrect, he ended up landing on the island of Hispaniola with his three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. So these are Columbus's three ships. And October 12th, 1492 was the date Columbus landed in the Americas. Now, of course, Columbus himself believed that he was in Asia. He actually didn't know where he was. He was obviously mistaken. It wasn't so obvious to him at the time. The people that he interacted with were the Taínos. The Taínos were the indigenous people on Hispaniola, which was an island. Go ahead and write that. Hispaniola is an island in the Caribbean. BB, two B's or two R's? Carib, two B's. An island in the Caribbean. And Columbus, believing that he had landed on islands called the East Indies, located in Asia, used the term Indian to describe the people that he came into contact with. And ever since that time, the name Indian has stuck. Now, here's a picture of the island of Hispaniola in your text. This was one of the first areas that Columbus chartered or came into contact with. He sailed around a little bit and then eventually made his way back to Spain. Now, recall, initially Columbus was supposed to obtain Eastern trade. When he returned back to Ferdinand and Isabella, he could not offer what he had promised. So instead, he promised the King and Queen of Spain to send him back on subsequent voyages. And this is something that we're not often taught, is that after Columbus's first voyage in 1492, he went back to the New World several more times, pretty much promising to bring back wealth in the form of slaves and gold. So instead of bringing back Eastern trade, Columbus stated that he could still bring back something of value, and that's where really in some ways Spanish conquest was born. These explorers, Columbus himself would write Probanza de Méritos, or proof of merits. These would be letters describing the quote unquote, and again, this is where the term New World comes from. Letters describing the New World to influence the Spanish rulers to send them back. In other words, these were ways of trying to get royal funding, or trying to get what we call royal patronage, which would be the support and financial resources to do that. Somebody like Christopher Columbus had the know-how to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, but not necessarily the funds to build 3 ships, to hire a crew of 90 men. In fact, the only people in Spain who had the resources to do that would have been the king or queen. So it was very important for these conquistadors, which were typically just maybe not necessarily young, but men looking to conquer, hence the word conquistadors, people and land in the New World. And Ferdinand and Isabella would receive these proofs of merit, these letters describing potentially some of the wealth that could be exploited. They also contained the aspect of spreading Christianity. And Ferdinand and Isabella and other successive Spanish monarchs essentially allowed for conquistadors to conquer in the name of Spain, to conquer in the name of Christianity, as long as they did it on behalf of the Spanish king. And so this allowed for then, in the aftermath of Columbus, and this is why Columbus is so significant, is that it really opened the floodgates for other Spaniards and other people in Europe. The proof of merits circulated around Europe, and for other people, other conquistadors, to go into the New World, to go into the America, and to conquer and steal the wealth of people that live there. It became a story of land and gold for these conquistadors. Other people who made their way to the New World included Amerigo Vespucci. He was an Italian explorer, or he was from Italy. We might just call him an explorer. Actually, Amerigo Vespucci, he was one of the first ones to recognize that this was in fact not Asia, that this was a new continent. And so one of the very earliest map makers named the New World, or the new continents, after him, America. So we'll say Amerigo Vespucci. He is the person, America, or the Americas. Person the Americas is named after. Right? So we don't live in North and South Colombia, but we live in North and South America. And this discovery, potentially, only added a little bit more fuel to the Spanish and Portuguese rivalry. Because remember, Spain wanted to gain a commercial advantage over Portugal. But by the time of 1494, Spain and Portugal had really kind of gone along two different paths. Portugal establishing trade with Western Africa, eventually making their way to India, and the Spanish sailing west, not really looking for trade, but rather just looking for conquest. And so one way that Spain and Portugal put their rivalry to a rest was with the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas was negotiated by the Pope, leader of the Roman Catholic Church. Both Spain and Portugal were Catholic nations. And the Treaty of Tordesillas split the world east and west between Portugal and Spain. And Spain. And if we see here, again, my pictures are a little bit off, but we'll just move them a little bit inwards. This is an early map. You can kind of get a sense for where the continents are located. This is the coast of Africa here. This is the coast of South America. And then the Caribbean islands here where Columbus landed. And essentially, if we look at the way that both Spain and Portugal explored, the Portuguese were really about sailing down this way, establishing bases and stuff like that here. Eventually, the Portuguese made their way over here and were able to exploit a lot of the trade in the Indian Ocean. Whereas the Spanish, on the other hand, made their way this way and ended up sending, conquistadors and other ambitious young men in the name of conquest. And so what the Treaty of Tordesillas did was that it split the world between the two. And so you can actually see the line a little bit here. But this is the line, right? And it said, according to this treaty, that everything on this side is Portugal. Everything on this side then belongs to Spain. And kind of interestingly enough, from this treaty, there was a small part of the New World that landed on Portugal's side. And if you know a little bit about languages in South America, this ended up being Brazil. And so whereas pretty much all of the Americas, maybe save North America, speak Spanish, Brazil, the primary language is Portuguese. And this goes all the way back to a treaty that was signed 500 years ago. Pretty remarkable to note how it has an impact on our world today. And really what that meant, at least for Spanish conquest of the New World, is that at least for Spain, that was one less enemy that the Spanish had to worry about. They didn't need to worry about fighting off the Portuguese. They only had to overcome the two most complex and powerful empires in the New World. So, of course, from last section, we know that one of those empires was the Aztec Empire, located in Mesoamerica. Tenochtitlan was the capital city. And the Spanish conquistador responsible for conquering the Aztecs was Hernan Cortés. So we're going to say Spanish conquistador who defeated the Aztecs. Right? Much like other Spanish conquistadors, there were rumors about a city in Mexico that had a lot of gold and wealth. As we know, the Aztecs frequently conquered their neighbors and extracted wealth from the surrounding area. So in a lot of ways, Tenochtitlan was a golden city. Cortez and his men took the Aztec ruler Montezuma hostage. So Montezuma, we'll say of him, he was the Aztec emperor. The Spanish also killed many of the Aztec priests. In the subsequent rebellion, Cortez was temporarily kicked out of the city. So we might say of the Aztec rebellion, we might say temporarily removed Cortez from the city. During the rebellion, Montezuma was killed by the Spaniards, and so the Aztec emperor was slain. However, Cortez's conquest wasn't done. There were really two things that were at work here that made Cortez's conquest possible or made the Spanish successful. One was the fact that many of the people living in the surrounding area of the Aztec Empire came to resent them. Recall that the Aztecs went to war with their neighbors very frequently, and that meant there were a lot of people who were willing to get revenge. So when Cortez regrouped his men, he went and approached local native allies, and they were more than willing to get revenge against the Aztec Empire. When Cortez returned, he had more Native Americans in his, or indigenous people, in his army than he had Spaniards. Another thing that was at work was disease. When Cortez and his men and his animals occupied the very densely populated area of Tenochtitlan. Recall, Tenochtitlan was a city that was built in a lake, so there's not really a lot of space. It was one of the most populated cities in the world. Smallpox absolutely decimated the Aztec population. So we'll say native resentment and smallpox made the Aztecs made the Aztecs vulnerable. Right, made them vulnerable. When Cortez returned, he was successful. Tenochtitlan was conquered, and the city was renamed to Mexico City. We might say about Mexico City, this became the capital of the Spanish Empire in the New World. One example, or maybe piece of evidence, we might say, for Cortez's success in his conquests was Melintzin, who served as a translator. We might say of Melintzin, she was a native woman who aided Cortez. This was one way that Cortez and his men could communicate with some of the native alliances or native people there to create alliances. Melintzin and Cortez had a child. This is believed to be the first Mestizo in the New World. Probably not, but at least that's what the textbook claims. And a Mestizo is a person who is born of mixed blood or mixed ancestry. So a Mestizo is a person, we might say, mixed blood of, in this case, it could really be any European. It's mostly, in this context, we're talking about Spanish, because you're more likely to see that in the Spanish colonies. It wasn't a term that was used in, the English colonies or anything like that. It's a Spanish word. But we'll just say European. Maybe we'll put Spanish in quotes here. And Native American. And in the Spanish Empire, for reasons we'll talk about in a later chapter, the Mestizo class actually became a considerable class in the what was called New Spain, or the Spanish Empire in the New World. And so just like that, one of the most complex and powerful civilizations fell at the hands of a Spanish conquistador, Hernan Cortez. Meanwhile, the Inca Empire, another very sophisticated and complex empire, fell at the hands of the conquistador Francisco Pizarro. So we'll say of him, he was the one who conquered the Inca. The Incan Emperor Atahualpa, this is the Incan Emperor, was captured by Pizarro. Pizarro and his men extracted a huge ransom, and then just like Montezuma, but probably more intentional in this case, Atahualpa was also murdered at the hands of the Spanish. One important thing to take note of is that by the time that Pizarro had made his way to the Incan Empire, disease had already gotten there first. So smallpox, in which played a role in Cortez's conquest, had made its way to the Inca Empire and began to wreak havoc on that empire before Francisco Pizarro arrived, also leaving the Inca vulnerable to outside attack. And so with that, both the Aztec and the Incas fell to the hands of the Spanish. Meanwhile, other explorers continued to make their way in North America, hoping to find another empire to conquer and plunder. The Spanish at the time didn't know that the Inca and the Aztecs were really the only two empires that were sophisticated enough that it warranted this type of conquest. But Hernan de Soto, he explored the southeastern United States. So we want to associate de Soto with the southeast, places like, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida was where he explored. Francisco Coronado explored the southwestern part of the United States. You can actually see an image here of some of his explorations. He was one of the first Europeans to lay eyes on the Grand Canyon. Both of these explorers, Coronado and de Soto, did not come across any empires quite on the scale of what the Aztecs and Incas had to offer. Now, all of this conquest allowed Spain to engage in what we might call a golden age. New World, silver and gold really led to a flourishing in not just a pure economic sense, but even in terms of things like art and literature. Enough money and funds that could go towards things like art. The ruling dynasty, especially successively after Ferdinand and Isabella, was the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty, we might say, is one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. In addition to controlling the Spanish throne, the Habsburg dynasty also controlled a lot of other European royal seats. They had rulers in Austria, the Netherlands, all sorts of different places. So one of the most powerful royal families really ever to exist, and certainly ever to exist in Europe. This Spanish Renaissance, or Renaissance, remember Renaissance means rebirth, was in part due to the wealth and silver and gold that poured into Spain as a result of the conquest. This is an image of one of the artistic works from the Spanish Golden Age, and perhaps story or novel, I don't know what it is that you might have heard before, but Don Quixote, a famous book or whatever it is by Miguel Cervantes, was one of the works that was published during this Golden Age, having a direct connection, or maybe not direct, but certainly having a connection to what the Spanish had found in the New World.